Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this program. My name is Greg Olsen, and I'm the director of the New York State Office for Aging. I have with me today Dr. Eric Kingson from Syracuse University, and I will officially talk about and introduce him in a second. But this topic is so critically important. It's really on Social Security. And everybody, I think, knows what Social Security is and thinks about it as a benefit for people who retire. But it's so much more than that. And I think, before you know where you're going, you got to know where you've been. And this is probably one of the most important public policy decisions and pieces in American history. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, where we are today with Social Security, but where we need to be in the future. What most probably people don't know that is prior to 1935, when Social Security was passed, 1 in every 2 or 50% of retirees lived in poverty. That has dropped down because of Social Security to about 9%. That's a major achievement. 70% of beneficiaries in New York are retirees, and we'll talk about who the other 30% are and things that you need to know about this. This is a program that helps impact 3.5 million New Yorkers, which 2.5 million are retirees, and pumps $65 billion annually into the economy and has lifted over 1.2 million people out of poverty. So I am so pleased. I have one of the nation's premier experts in Social Security, but also a friend of mine, Dr. Eric Kingson. So let me tell you a little bit about Eric, and then Eric, we will dive right into this. So Dr. Kingson is a professor of social work at Syracuse University. He's been there since 1998. He is also, talk a little bit about that. This is an organization that was launched and is staffed and for the Strengthened Social Security Coalition, which Eric now serves as its board chair. Eric has served as a policy advisor to 2 presidential commissions: the 1982-83 National Commission on Social Security Reform and the 94 Bipartisan Commission on Entitlement and Tax Reform. Previously, on the social work faculties of Boston College and the University of Maryland, he directed the Emerging Issues in Aging program of the Gerontological Society of America. In 2015, the Gerontological Society recognized him with its Donald P. Kent Award, which is given annually to a member who demonstrate the highest standard of professional leadership in gerontology through teaching, service, and interpretation of gerontology to the larger society. He is the author of many articles, books for academic and general audiences. He writes about the politics and economics of aging, Social Security, cross-generational responsibilities, and caregiving across generations. And he also has a new book that just came out addressing some of the things that and much more that we're going to talk about today. So, Eric, it's great to have you. I wish that when I was at Syracuse, you were there at the time. I had just preceded you by a year or 2, but it's so great to have you.
The good thing is you had our good friend Professor Alejandro Garcia.
Absolutely did, and changed the course of my life, which is why I'm here today. So I gave a little bit, you know this stuff inside and out. It is such an important social statement, what Social Security is, what it means, and how important it is to people that probably don't know it until they need it. So let's do a little bit of historical background. How and why did Social Security come about?
Well, it was part of a process, obviously. It came about in 1935, enacted during the Roosevelt administration. There's a little history before that. The number of states had what they called widow pensions, old age pensions, and blind pensions. And state-run state programs, they were going pretty much belly up during the Depression. Roosevelt wanted to provide a basis of protection. As you know, Greg, in addition to providing benefits for older Americans, Social Security also provides survivor benefits and benefits for people with disabilities. Back then, it was a bit different, but we saw things extend out. So it's passed in 1935. There's a struggle for a few years to gain its acceptance. But mid-1950s, early 1950s, it was it was a bipartisan supported program. Even a moderate conservative president like President Eisenhower did not try to pull it apart at all, and in fact supported some changes. Eisenhower was very clear. He has this wonderful quote where he says, if any politician wants to eliminate Social Security, farm subsidies and the like, they will not be heard again in our country's future. There are, of course, a few aberrant members. There are a few aberrant people, but they are small numbers and they are stupid, is what he wrote to his brother. And he kind of goes on. Basically, it was widely supported. The program in the 1950s expands. It adds agricultural workers. It adds some professional workers. It provides benefit improvements. In 1956, it adds disability insurance and also early retirement benefits. In the 1960s, there was opportunity to address some of that poverty you were talking about. And the economy was going well. There was still bipartisan support, and the program benefits were increased and other additions were made. And that's sort of the story. Enactment, after years of trying to get the idea, and enactment involved social insurance like Social Security and unemployment insurance, but also the welfare programs, old age assistance, aid to the blind, aid to dependent children, and in some public health programs and some social services. So by the 1960s, we were in a expansion mode to a degree. The economy was good, we could afford it, and there was lots of need out there. Large numbers of older people, as an example, about almost 40% of them had incomes below the poverty line before 1960. So we see expansion, and then sometime in the middle of the 1970s, it gets much harder. The politics of Social Security becomes more contentious. We have this financing problem that emerges in part because we have high inflation and high unemployment occurring at the same time. Social Security is based on a payroll contribution. Less money's coming in, more money's going out during a recession. And we have major changes in 1977 and again in 1983 that the program required changes, or it really would have been unable to pay all of its benefits going to 1983. If the 1983 Amendments to Social Security Acts hadn't passed, we would have found Congress would have had to reduce benefits for everyone. And I don't think anyone would really like to be in Congress at the point in time that they reduce benefits to millions of older people, people with disabilities, surviving children, and the like. So in 1983, we had this set of amendments that was supported through bipartisan processes. It involved some benefit cuts, some revenue increases, more on the benefit cut side, but they were a different type of cut, and it was a different period. Our economy is expanding. The incomes of people as they get older are getting higher. Our pension system, private pension and public employee pension system is well in place. So we see this change, and then all of a sudden, the ink isn't dry on the 1983 amendments, and those who are opposed to Social Security launch it's written out in a paper by two very conservative folks from the Heritage Foundation. It says basically, the paper's called A Leninist Approach to Deconstructing Social Security. And the argument they make is, look, this is a popular program. You got to tell old people, don't worry, be happy, we're not going to hurt you. You got to tell young people the program isn't going to be there, it's not sustainable. And you got to work with banks and Wall Street to build the argument for privatizing the program.
Yeah. And we saw all of that in the 90s, which is why I think that, why having you on is so important to talk about this. So, for somebody who's retired, they know exactly what the benefit is of Social Security. But, as you mentioned, 30% of New Yorkers, 14% are disabled workers, 4% are spouses, and then 12% are widowers and children. So there's a variety of folks out there that have a insurance against some of these things that they don't even know exist until you actually need it. And, the idea of going from widespread support, as you talked about, from the 30s, 40s, and 50s to a real coordinated and thoughtful effort to privatize, to make it sound like to younger individuals that it's not going to be there, and there's other ways to do this and give the money to the banks. We saw exactly your history play itself out. So you talk about.
So it was written in that article and the script was followed. Nothing really happened until the 90s, except for one other thing. We started talking about people like me now being greedy geezers. When I was in my early 30s, I'm being told those old folks are taking your Social Security. And in your case, you weren't hearing that, but generations that have moved into aging in this period and through early middle age and we're told that. And so it had a major impact on public confidence in the program. Mm-hmm. And it would come up in different ways. The arguments were Social Security is unfair to poor people because it doesn't eliminate all poverty. It's unfair to rich people because it gives proportionally more to poor people. It's unfair to African Americans because African Americans don't live as long as white non-Hispanic Americans, which is true, but also there's a whole different story in it. It's unfair to women. Women live longer. So they threw that at it. They threw a lot of spaghetti on the wall. The next thing they threw at it was a set of arguments. All politicians love Social Security. Pardon the histrionics here, but every politician loves this program. They don't want to do any harm, but they want to fix it. I hate to say it this way, I hope no one's offended, kind of like we fixed our male dog at one point. They basically want to fix the program, meaning they want to save it. They want to cut benefits, basically. Right. They make that argument. We can't afford it. That argument doesn't go too far in the 90s, but come the early 2000s, President George Bush, after his second election, decides that he's going to push for the privatization idea. This is before the 2007 and 8 recession. At first, it seems like there would be a partial privatization, but the more the public learned about the idea, the more it moved away from it. And that is important, and privatization, at least for a long time, for a while, went off the table. Come 2008, we move into a deficit mania. The argument that's now driving Social Security politics is, we love it, but we can't afford it. We won't be able to pay for future generations.
Right. So we're going to get there in a second, because there's a difference between making a claim if you do nothing versus some strategies to assure that that doesn't happen. So I don't want you to get ahead of yourself first, because we're going to get there, because I think that the advice based on your long history and knowledge of Social Security is that there are minor fixes to make sure that it remains solvent, not that you have to cut benefits. But let's talk about, you've mentioned to me a couple of
different. I'll just ask Roger if he could put up the Social Security works for New York State, and then after that, Social Security works for the United States.
You got it. So there was some of the numbers that we talked about. So that's the national numbers in terms of the number of individuals across the country. Of course, part of your slide deck, and I believe we'll be linking to this, has the New York numbers that I mentioned at the outset. But you make the point that Social Security is insurance and not savings. Can you just briefly tell folks why that is?
Yeah, the program protects against risks for everyone, not just middle income, not just rich people, not just poor people. You need insurance. If you own a home, you don't save in case the home burns down. You buy insurance for it. And of course, you still hope it doesn't burn down. But if you need insurance, That's insurance. If you need to protect against fire, that's the proper vehicle. The same thing for Social Security. It protects against certain risks. Living too long, retiring and living too long, experience a work disability, a major one, earlier in your life, dying and leaving young children, and also dying and leaving a spouse. These are hugely important protections. Most people don't know that young children have the major life insurance most young children have. Say 3, 4, 7, 8-year-old, the major life insurance families have is Social Security. You're a young person with a spouse and you earn about $35,000 on average. If you die, you have a couple of kids ages 3 and 5. If you die, Social Security's value is about $700,000 to your kids. It's like a $700,000 term life insurance. That's huge. So we protect against risks. It's not a savings bank. And it's a very different perspective to take, but it's the perspective it was originated with. The FICA contribution is called the Federal Insurance Contribution Act. That's what involves us in providing a 6.2% contribution with an employer match on earnings up to a certain level. It was always seen as an insurance program. And when we get away from that idea, we get into trouble. And we get these other words coming out, like entitlement, the idea that it's not earned. We are certainly entitled to the benefit through our hard work, but the notion of the entitlement crisis, which really was hatched in the presidential commission I was involved with, or pushed very hard, is an argument for cutting the program. It's, again, we can't afford it. We want to save it for our kids.
Right, which we know is not the case. And everybody who earns a paycheck sees the FICA deduction. Everybody's involved up to a cap. We're all paying in so that in the event that you retire or you're one of the 30% that's not retired, as you said, whether it be homeowners insurance or car insurance or boat insurance or whatever it is, if everybody pays a little bit, that creates the whole and then is allowed to pay to provide that type of economic security. So let's talk about today. So you co-founded Social Security Works with Nancy Altman, a couple of others. Tell us why you're focused. I think I know the answer to this, and so are others as I'm answering. But why are you focused on how well the system works, given the history that you talked about? Recently, as of 2008, there were additional efforts, but more importantly, that we don't have to go on this negative bent about an entitlement or it's not fair for XYZ, but what it really does and what steps really could be taken, after 2034, if the actuarials are right, to make sure that this program that is so vital to 50 million Americans, maintains itself and strengthened, and why people need to be involved and be paying attention.
Well, Greg, you're asking why did we put Social Security Works together and why did we emphasize that Social Security works? Firstly, I mean, just say, regardless of all the trouble, all the political dissonance around Social Security, the public is universally favorable to it. Doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. The vast majority see it as the most consequential policy we have. It cuts across race, it cuts across age group, et cetera. We've seen the program undergo a series of attacks over 30 years or so, 40 years. And part of what we wanted to do, and I think did do, is emphasize its importance and also emphasize what people think about the program outside of the Beltway. The politicians were all getting caught up in this notion of, well, we're going to have to do something to save the program. Even liberals, the most liberal members of Congress were saying, well, don't cut it. Many members of Congress were saying, Democrat and Republican, we have to be sensible, we have to cut it. And some people are saying, let's really eviscerate it, but we'll call it a good change. That was emerging around 2009, especially, but it was a theme that was being built really since the early 1980s, but it came into fruition around 2008-9 as President Obama became president. We were concerned to get the discussion outside of Washington because there was a groupthink that said, we've got to cut it for the good of our kids. And then in that context, proposals were put together that dramatically would have changed the program dramatically and would have cut more revenue from the program to provide benefits than the problem that existed. So we worked hard. The discussion I mentioned, the framing back then was, how much do we cut? It was not, again, some said, don't cut it all. What?
Right? It's not how can we strengthen it, it's how much can we cut.
Yes, although it was how can we strengthen it, how much should we cut?
Right.
It was framed in those terms.
Those two things don't match, right? Do they?
Yeah. So we worked on messaging. I mean, basically, the public understands a lot of this. Social Security is a system similar to our military, similar to our highway system. It's a foundation of basic security. There are problems in our highway system periodically, but we don't go screaming, let's tear up the highway system. We address them and we expand that system too. Same thing with Social Security. It's basic protection for our families. Every generation since its enactment has worked to improve it and strengthen it. And so basically the program works, and it works better than many other things. It's a vital system. It is the most efficient, widespread, and most reliable way for Americans to protect their retirement savings. Same thing for their life insurance, survivorship. Private investments, as good as they may be, and as we all would like some, they're inherently risky, as everyone found out around 2007 recession, right, which is part of what killed privatization. So even those of us who are sophisticated, and I'm not among them as an investor, but those of us who are can lose a lot of money. Imagine waking up right after the recession and you're about to retire and you see your savings diminished by 50%.
Yeah, that was exactly what happened, 50%. And that's in addition to Social Security, not a replacement for, if you're fortunate enough to do that. So Eric, let me ask you about, people know about actuarials and what they do, and they do projections based on the data that they have at the time. But right now, the actuaries, suggest that we can pay out with no changes, full benefits until around 2034. And that may change a little bit here and there because these come out annually, the same thing with Medicare, et cetera. And then roughly it would be about 25 cents short, or be able to cover 75.
Yeah, actually, I gave you the wrong info. It's 22% short, 22 cents short. My fault. That's what I said to you the other day.
So what are the types of things, again, if those actuarials come to fruition, what are the kinds of things that can be done to bring that back up to 100 or even exceed the 100% without making the cut? Because the cut really doesn't need to happen if you look at strategies, and it just shouldn't be a cut mentality.
Mm-hmm. Look, let me back up a little bit and say why we have these actuarial predictions, or not predictions, analyses. This is a program that has a 75-year horizon. Most Social Security, social insurance programs don't look out that far. It's an important public trust. Periodically, there are going to be problems, or there's going to be sometimes there's going to be more money anticipated. The idea of the actuarial analysis that's taken place every year since the program was implemented is to provide an early warning if something needs to be done years down, a number of years forward. So it shouldn't be a call, each publication in April or May when it comes out. Today, it's been greeted increasingly with the argument, oh my God, the program's going broke. It only has sufficient revenues to go to 2034. And what you just repeated, not that you're taking that argument, and it's used as an opportunity to message against the program. So understanding that the actuarial system is a strength of the program, that we can look out forward. The program, again, which is essentially wage insurance, not a savings, but wage insurance against lost wages when you retire, disabled, et cetera. That's a foundation of our program, of our system. Going forward, Greg, you're saying, what can we do? Is that the, okay. Well, I would start again, I would back up and say, I don't think we should even be talking about cutting benefits at all.
I agree.
Are.
Right.
We
So that's
are.
Put that off of here because that has been a conversation. But you and the folks that you work with, and we'll make sure that Social Security Works, your new organization, is in the chat for people to stay up to speed and continue to communicate with you guys. But what are some of the simple types of things that can be done so we're not talking about that? And then you and I talked about there's an appetite to talk about expansion. So let's talk about how to shore up with some tweaks potentially. And then let's talk about expansion and how people are even talking about that.
Okay. And I want to go back to right when Social Security Works was organized, and then when we developed a coalition of 300 groups, unions, some of the aging groups, women's groups. The story was, how much should we cut? Over time, we saw that change. The argument, as you know, I'll make is we shouldn't be talking at all about cutting. We ought to be talking about how much should we expand the program. The program is a solution to basic problems the American people face, those risks we talk about. And it can do more, and it ought to do more. And we can afford it. This notion that we're a poor nation doesn't serve most people very well. It serves those who have tremendous wealth and those who dislike the idea of using government to address some things that we can't address very well by ourselves. And so the discussion is often framed in, okay, what should we do to, what kind of tweaks? And I say one person's tweak is another person's major cut. If you tweaked it the way some seemingly and presented as objective approaches to reducing benefits, those arguments that were made to do that, if we tweaked it that way, it would have meant young people would have gotten a much smaller benefit when they reached their old age, today's working people. It would have meant that retirement ages would have increased, age of eligibility for full benefit. There are lots of ideas that were floated in the context of, well, we got to fix this thing. And we fix it kind of like by pulling it apart. So if you went that way, one could go the way of the 1983 Commission, which is some payroll contribution adjustments and some benefit reductions, which are reductions, raising the age of eligibility for retirement. That's a cut. Every year you raise it, it's a 7% cut for people coming on. It could be, there are many things you could do. Hold back the cost of living adjustment. So there are changes that could be made. A 50 cents a week increase, a sort of staged small increase in payroll contributions, so that in year one, you're paying an extra 50 cents a week. Year two, an extra $1 a week. Year 25, you're paying $12.50 a week. No, actually a month, I'm sorry. You're paying an extra $12.50 a month. That change, which most Americans, when they're polled, say they would much prefer than to see cuts, that change is not devastating. We've seen payroll contributions go up before, and we don't feel it. They go up gradually. They go up also when our economy is expanding. And so this is something we can afford. If you would put on, Roger, the very last slide I think you have on gross domestic product.
Yeah, and while Roger, here it comes.
Okay, maybe keep going. There we go. That last one, GDP. So with all the talk about how we can't afford Social Security, here's what happens as our society ages. Now we know that it's not just the aging of so-called baby boomers that is happening. It's the aging of our society. Long after the baby boomers are dead, we're going to have a society with a large number of older people, proportion number of older people significantly increased. So here's what we see in gross domestic product. That's how much, what percent of what we produce each year do we pay out in Social Security benefits? Right now, we're paying about 5% of everything we produce. As the baby boom cohorts age into 2035, when they're all 65 and over, we see it tip up a little bit to 5%, a little bit. It goes a bit above that by the 2070s. Now, most of us are dead then, at least the baby boomers are. And then it goes up a little more in 2080 because the population continues to age, and then it starts dropping a bit after that. This is not a lot of money for a society to pay, and the richest, the most wealthy society in the history of the world can easily afford it. We're just not convinced that we can. This is a protection for all of us as we get older. So there are lots of things that can be done. I think one of the arguments we made, and a lot of people have picked that up, and we're not the first people to argue this perhaps, is that we should be talking about expansion, not cutting benefits. That in the United States, we face a number of very critical crises. We face a retirement security crisis for today's older Americans. We face a retirement crisis for today's working Americans. There's an estimate that it varies, but Boston College has a center on retirement policy. They estimated about, over the years, 50% of today's workers will be unable to maintain their standard of living, even if they work up to age 67, and if they convert their homes into equity, et cetera. We're looking at half of the public not being able to maintain their maintain their income in retirement. And that's only part of it, because when you add in health expenses that aren't covered by Medicare and long-term care or community-based care expenditures, it really goes up to about 2/3. That's a real problem and ought to be addressed. Sorry, Greg, go on.
No, go ahead.
Another real problem is care work. And that just sort of really became clear in the course of COVID-19. Most care work is critical. In its absence, we would be without a society. It's often given, but not exclusively given. Care is often given by women, more often than by men, but a lot of people are care workers, caregivers in the home. Some children are. Some children have had to help take care of their parents. We pay a very low salary to most people who do this very difficult work of caring and very essential work. In spite of that, most of those caregivers give their heart and soul to it, and they keep working. But we basically don't focus enough on care work. There are things we can do through Social Security and other vehicles that underwrite that protection. We also have, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, and I love those ideas. And, I think some of the things that we're also, have to recognize, and I certainly know you do, is, people changed. Why I don't like raising the retirement age is because it doesn't take into account exactly the kind of worker you're talking about. People that are doing physical work, people that might be ethnic and cultural minorities that don't live as long, that could be doing construction and other types of things where not only is the pay not as good, but it's real physically taxing. And retiring at an earlier age, is really important. I think that's really important. And the income coming in, the millennials are a bigger age group than the baby boomers. So, and you look at the unemployment rate, which is down. So there's additional dollars going into the system. But I love the idea of the expansion. And what I wanted to ask you about, because, everybody pays into Social Security, but not everybody pays at the same rate. So if I make $100,000, my entire 12-month paycheck, I'm paying FICA, and I have no problem doing that. But if I'm making $500,000, what's the cap on what I'm paying? And is that potentially a solution? Like, we're not talking about additional ways to raise revenue. The The idea is always about, as you've been talking so eloquently, is how to cut. And then what winds up happening, that further erodes the confidence if those things do happen, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, is there talk about lifting the cap on
that's increasingly a very popular proposal. There's one bill we might talk about, Congressman Larson's bill, which includes a raising of the cap for people who have earnings above $400,000. Essentially, the messaging way to say that is we would like millionaires and billionaires to pay the same payroll contribution rate as everyone else, as everyone who works. So if you're a super billionaire, you're finished with your Social Security tax contributions very quickly. So I think it's about $144,700, $144,000. Above that, you pay nothing. So there are many ways that could be done. If we lifted it all at once, it would address roughly 2/3 of that shortfall we're projecting. There are some reasons we might not want to do that. If we wanted to lift it at a certain level above that, it addresses a significant amount. And so that's something that's very positively received by the public. So you're right. As far as retirement age increases, right now, the age of eligibility for you, Greg, is 67. For me, it was 65. The 1983 amendments gradually increased that. That means your benefit is essentially 14% smaller than my benefit. No matter what they say, the argument is, well, gosh, people are living longer and they're healthy and living longer, which isn't all true, but they are. Over the years, we have lived longer, but they're living longer. They should be very comfortable working longer and paying contributions longer. And this isn't a cut. This is just an adjustment to adjust for increases in life expectancy. It's a cut. It's an absolute cut, indistinguishable from cutting a portion of the cost of living adjustment. So the alternative, there have been polling studies that were done. National Academy of Social Insurance did one a few years ago, did focus groups and also surveys working with the National Polling Organization, found very clearly that the public is open to expanding and to paying a little bit more and did not want to cut benefits. So if anyone wants to see that, they can go to www.nasi.org.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be a surprise, again, these long standing coordinated campaigns that just year after year put question marks in people's head that don't need to be there. I'm not surprised at all that's what folks would support. So, one of the things that you talk about, and I think the beauty of Social Security Works, and I think we did put that link in the chat box, is, how you undo that, decades worth of negative messaging, turn this into an everybody under the umbrella, and how this really can be a unifying force for our country. So talk a little bit about that and how people can get involved, because I think that the organization that you founded is really looking for that. The more people you touch with facts and figures and stay in the loop that this really matters, not just for retirement, but you don't know what's going to happen next. My mom didn't expect to blow her back out at 40 years old, getting off a bike and wind up being on Social Security disability, but it was there for her. And probably didn't know it at the time, right? So talk about your efforts to try to really unify around messaging that will not only strengthen but expand, because I love the expansion idea. And you're right about the fundamentals of the the types of incomes people make now, the wealth gap between individuals and wealthy folks, that the erosion of what the dollar means, like wages that are not keeping up. There really is some concern in the future.
So the work that we did involved messaging, it involved lobbying, it involved working with many other groups to involve people outside of Washington. And it really you don't really have to teach people that this program is important. They know it.
Right.
We're talking about 65 million, what do my numbers say? Yeah, 65 million Americans getting a benefit each month. In New York State, if we wanted to put that up on the chart.
3.5 million.
What?
3.5 million people in New York.
Yeah, each year it goes up. Now it's 3.6, almost 3.7 million. It just, this is essential. This is, again, as important as the highway system is to transportation. You can't pull this apart. And the public ultimately wouldn't let you. We wanted to get the voice of people outside the discussion into Washington. We have a coalition that we helped spawn of some 350 organizations plus or minus. And the core of it is a steering committee of about 30 organizations. So this isn't all Social Security works. The Strengthen Social Security Coalition has played a major role in both trying to block cuts and has been quite successful in that, and also has been successful in putting forward the idea we ought to expand Social Security. And not just Social Security, by the way. We also ought to improve SSI, which is a welfare-based public assistance program. We also ought to be thinking about expansions in Medicare. We've all heard the story of seniors have eyes, ears, and teeth. We don't cover that very well under Medicare. It's long past due. So some of it was also doing media work. And until recently, most articles in the media were always talking about, well, the Social Security program is having lots of problems, this and that, forgetting the fact that there's 63 million people out there who get a check, 66, a check each and every month, and how important that is to their lives, and to our communities. And up in my area, if you look at a congressional district, New York 24, there are some 650,000 people. 130,000 of them, roughly, were receiving benefits each and every month, benefits that are critical to our economy and critical, of course, to their families, and also critical to their young members, because those of us who are over 65, we don't want to have to move in with our younger children, our children. We might want to. We might want to have that choice, and depending on things. But in the old days, that had to happen for a lot of people. In the old days, going back to the turn of the century, 19th century, we had something like 2,400 children who were in asylums. They were the children of, not asylum, orphanages, the children of mostly of widows who couldn't afford them. That doesn't happen today. This system made that change. So
yeah. And that's so critical. And we're going to post the report that you sent, the 2019 report. I like the way you guys, divvied it up by congressional district. But the point that you made, which I'm glad you made it, or I would have, but I'm going to reinforce it, is this is $65 billion that are coming into the pockets of New Yorkers. You talked about how important that is for them personally. And of course it is. But you're absolutely right. This is supporting the local school districts, property taxes. It's paying rent. It's supporting local businesses. And so, the economic engine of New York. And, we've been aggregating data forever. So on top of the 65 billion, you got 10.8 billion in the New York State retirement system that gets pumped back into New York. And, people over the age of 50 represent 68% of all the household income generated in New York State. It's 481 billion a year. So you're absolutely right. You start with the benefit to the individual, the family, the individual with a disability, the survivor, the widow. But this is a huge deal for the local, state, and regional economy as well.
Yeah, it is. And I want to get to the values question, because I think that's extraordinarily important. And something else I'll mention after that. But I started out in Social Security. Back when I started studying it, I had worked for a couple of years in a retired senior volunteer program. I had done a number of kinds of community service types of programs. I kind of thought Social Security was not so great. After all, rich people got it. And why should they get it? And I know the answer today very well. I learned it very quickly, which is this is a system for everyone. And nobody knows what's going to happen to them in life. We know actuarially that someone who turns 21 today has a roughly 50% chance of becoming disabled or dying. It's 35% becoming disabled or dying before their retirement age. So these are, we don't think about that, but it's critically important. But it's important for something else too. We're seeing our society being pulled apart by differences, real and unreal, but that people believe are there, and holds serious beliefs that some horrible things are happening and the government isn't working, it can't work, whatever it is. This is a system that joins us together. It's a system that unites us. It's a system that reflects core biblical, core Quranian, core values about honoring one's parents, honoring one's neighbor, caring for the neighbor, and also you have a responsibility to work and you have a responsibility to help care for your family. But we also have a responsibility to protect ourselves. So we have a system that works, the public likes, and it's something we don't argue over that much. And that value base for me became extraordinarily important because the dollars and cents are hugely important. Don't get me wrong. It's fantastic. This is the most important income protection most Americans have towards their retirement, their disability, or surviving. Doesn't matter for most people if they have a little bit of savings or whatever. The core thing they're going to find is Social Security for the vast majority is the foundation of their retirement. So that's extremely important. And we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to our neighbors. But it's also something that I think I became passionate about in part as I began to understand more about how it gives expression to values we hold in common as a society. Some of us may not have those biblical values, but we still think we have some obligation to others. We have some obligation to our parents. It doesn't matter what religion or what values we hold. I think that part of the discussion hasn't been emphasized enough. We've always focused on, no, it's not going broke. Advocates like myself and a scholar like myself, I'm a scholar, but I've also crossed the line into being an advocate. We react. It's not being cut. Privatization is going to hurt. That's important. But that positive message of this is a system that does some things we can't do by ourselves. This is a system that expresses core values. That's what needs to be messaged too, because part of it is facts and figures, but a lot of it is people's gut responses.
Right.
And that, you go out and that's hugely important. And those of us who are often on this side of the argument lose, and I've done this in the past, lose the argument because we start saying, it's not such a big problem. Okay, you've already said it's a problem. It's something we can handle, and you've already fed into the dialogue. And the reality is, this is a solution. This has been a solution for Americans, and it will continue to be. And it can be a solution in expanding it. For instance, one of the proposals that is out there is to provide to our grandchildren and children, some of us too, protection against loss of income at birth of a child. We're the only nation, only one of 3 nations that do not provide that. Suriname and one other nation does not provide maternal benefits, as an example. That kind of protection is huge. Protection against loss of income in sickness. We've seen how important that is in terms of the COVID experience, just as we've seen how important care work is. Protection against living too long. That's something Social Security provides, but it could do better. So these are areas that we can improve, and for which there's a considerable there's a taste for improving.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to hear about some of the things you just mentioned. I think that you're right on. So, Eric, we do have a couple of questions, but I want to ask you one more before I ask Kelly to open it up for a couple of the questions that we have. So you talked about a lot of things, the important rich history. I love the values conversation. I love the expansion conversation and recognizing how different things are in 2022 and probably will be in 30 and 40 than they were in 1940. And you have to think about all of those things. So you got a lot of good ideas. There's a big coalition out there. People are thinking about ways to expand, change the the lens from a negative lens to a positive lens. How can people get involved and help to protect and expand Social Security?
It's one of the important things is to call and write or email your members of Congress. They are responsive. One reason Social Security is protected is because the public knows something about the program. There's a bill in Congress called Social Security 2100. And this bill would do a number of very important things. I would love it to do more, but politically it can only do so much. It's under review right now by Ways and Means in the House. Congressman John Larson is the chief author of it. There are 200 members of Congress who have signed on to the bill. That's a lot, given that 10 years ago you could hardly get a single person to say, don't cut, or to anyone to say expand. This bill does a few things, and it's important for us as older people, it's important for our children that we get behind it, that we work on it. It addresses about half of the projected shortfall. It extends the date of what's called exhaustion of the trust fund. It extends it from 2034 to 38, but more importantly, it cuts about half of the 75-year projection. It also improves the cost of living adjustment. We have a cost of living adjustment, which is hugely important. It's an important feature of Social Security, but it's a little bit light in terms of protecting older people and people with disabilities. There's an alternative out there called the CPI, Consumer Price Index for the elderly. And implementing that would make a big difference. And we also have proposals in this bill, although most of these are short-term, unfortunately, because of budgeting, but we have proposals to allow spouses, if their widowers benefits aren't larger than their combined benefits, they can receive 75% of the combined benefit of a couple. It has caregiver protections. It provides benefits. It acknowledges that giving care to a family member, young or old, or in between, that affects how much you can work. There's an offset for that. It addresses, for people who've worked long and hard over their entire lives, but sometimes the benefit isn't larger than the poverty level. It improves the special minimum benefits so that it's about 125% of poverty, or forget. So there are a lot of things that are in this bill we should like. It includes, there are lots.
I think you're hitting all the right notes. I mean, this is a really important bill. Is this something that you guys have a summary on? And I'm moving along, Eric, not to cut you off, but we only have about 8 minutes, and I want to make sure we get a couple questions.
I'm sure we can send you one. One of the things that's happened is the bill's been changing a lot.
Yeah.
So it eliminates the payroll contribution, that is, it increases it to 100% of the regular. It takes the cap off. Everyone would be paying above $400,000 the same amount of money that people pay now below $145,000.
Yeah, that
the
seems
same percentage.
Yeah,
that's important revenue. So
that's great.
There have been a lot of changes because that's what happens in a significant bill. We need to get behind these ideas and build momentum for them. There are many groups that are working on it. Social Security Works is very significantly involved. socialsecurityworks.org. The National Committee to Protect Social Security and Medicare They're important. Some of the veterans groups are behind these things. Some of certainly the disability community is behind this. So we ought to build on this. We are hoping we'll see it come out of committee maybe in late March. And we're hoping the possibility will exist, and it's the best shot we've had in about 30 years to improve benefits. And it certainly gets the idea out there. We shouldn't be cutting these benefits. So finding support.
Really exciting.
Finding
Kelly,
support
you have a couple
among your
questions?
members. Sorry? Just call your members' offices, write letters, write to the newspapers,
Yeah,
your
well, we're
community papers.
make sure that we get
hugely
the
important.
summary so that we can help people know what they're writing about. I think the general concept is don't cut, expand, but I think you hit a lot of really, really important points that it's certainly for the work that we do, many people would be interested in. Kelly, just in an amount of time, we only have a couple minutes. I know there's a couple questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Greg. We had a question that is, how do you see the conversation and debate about Social Security relating to ageism?
Very much so. Now, again, the beginning in the 1980s, when the arguments were working against Social Security, the greedy geezer idea emerges. It's not going to be there for young people. They're taking advantage of it. There is a failure to understand the core protections and the protections that flow through the entire age range. It's a good political argument for those who want to make a case for cutting it, but it's not accurate. And that kind of ageism is pernicious. Or those old people really don't need it because they're really well off. Well,
yeah, I mean, it's like anything else. You combat that kind of thing with facts. The 2019 report, the larger slide deck that you showed, your new organization, you combat myths with facts so that you can have a real conversation about what matters and not about, what doesn't matter. Kelly, do you have another question?
Yes, Greg. We had a question on your thoughts about replacing Social Security with basic minimum income.
I don't think we would end up with anything near the protection that we have in Social Security. This isn't a political environment where that kind of change could be entertained. I think the income guarantee idea is a good idea, but it's not a replacement at all for Social Security. And I would steer as far away from it as I could if it's presented as such. That would be an excuse to basically eviscerate Social Security.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for that question, Kelly. So again, Dr. Kingson, Eric, it's such a pleasure to have you. For folks that are listening either live today or in the future, Social Security Works is the organization. I think there's some work that we need to do to, help support the legislation that Dr. Kingson is talking about and what elements are in there. I just want to point out, while this passed in 1935, the idea of doing something like this began in the 1800s. It took a very long time. And to the point, the politics behind this sometimes are difficult to address. We do not want to be losing ground at a time where things are changing. We need to be gaining ground. So I think this is something we all need to continue to be involved with, regardless of what age you are, because, the retirement benefit only pays out for 70%. The other 30% are not retired. They are, again, children, spouses, widows, people with disabilities. This matters to everybody. So I can't thank you enough for being here. As always, I want to thank Kelly Matija, Roger Noyes, for my communications staff for making these productions flawless. We'll be back in a couple weeks with our friends from Hunger Solutions to talk about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and the new enhanced or simplified SNAP application that is going to be very beneficial to older adults. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks for being there, everybody.